Hi, I'm Natalie. My mother stood in front of 30 family members and declared that I never help anyone but myself. She pointed her manicured finger right at me and said I was selfish, ungrateful, and had never contributed a single dollar to this family. The room went silent. Every cousin, aunt, and uncle stared at me like I was the villain in our family story. But then I pulled out my phone, opened my banking app, and what happened next made my mother's face turn white as paper. Want to know what those payment records revealed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun blazed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Tyler's new house in Westlake Hills, casting everything in that golden Texas light that makes even the most ordinary moments feel cinematic. I stood in the entryway, holding a housewarming gift wrapped in silver paper, watching my family mill around the marble kitchen island like they owned the place. Which, in their minds, they probably did. Success had a way of making the Brooks family feel entitled to everything and everyone around them. Tyler had done well for himself. The house was one of those modern Austin showpieces, with clean lines, native stone accents, and a view of the hill country that probably cost more than most people make in 5 years. His wife Vanessa glided between guests in a white sundress that screamed designer, her blonde hair swept into one of those effortless updos that actually takes an hour to perfect. She kissed cheeks and accepted compliments about their new home with the grace of someone who had never doubted she deserved nice things. I smoothed down my navy blue dress and checked my reflection in the hallway mirror. The dress was from Target, purchased on sale 3 months ago, but it was clean and pressed and made me feel professional. Which was important, because in this family, appearances mattered more than truth. I had learned that lesson the hard way over the years. The drive from my downtown Austin apartment had taken 45 minutes in Saturday traffic, winding through neighborhoods that grew progressively more expensive with each mile. My Honda Civic looked out of place in the circular driveway next to the BMWs and Mercedes, but I had parked it proudly anyway. I worked hard for that car, paid it off early and maintained it myself. Something my family would never understand. As I walked through the house, I caught fragments of conversations about stock portfolios, vacation homes, and private schools. Uncle Frank was holding court near the outdoor bar, telling anyone who would listen about his latest real estate investment. Cousin Derek nodded along enthusiastically, his wife clutching a glass of wine that probably cost more than my grocery budget for the week. These gatherings always felt like performances. Everyone competing to see who could sound the most successful. My parents stood near the kitchen, my father Robert in his standard weekend uniform of khakis and a polo shirt, my mother Patricia dressed in what I recognized as a new outfit from Nordstrom. She had that particular smile she wore at family events, the one that said she was keeping score of everything and everyone. Her eyes swept the room constantly, cataloging who was wearing what, who looked tired, who had gained weight, who seemed to be struggling. Information was currency in our family, and my mother was the central bank. "Natalie!" Tyler spotted me and walked over with his arms outstretched. At 32, my older brother had inherited our father's height and our mother's ambition. He wrapped me in a hug that felt genuine, which surprised me. "I'm so glad you could make it. Work has been crazy, right?" I nodded and handed him the gift. "Congratulations on the house. It's beautiful." Inside the wrapping was a set of high-quality kitchen towels from Williams-Sonoma, something practical but nice. I had spent more than I should have, but Tyler was my brother, and despite everything, I wanted to support his happiness. "You didn't have to bring anything," he said, but I could tell he was pleased. "Come on, let me show you around." Vanessa is dying to give everyone the full tour. The house was impressive, I had to admit. 5 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a 3-car garage, and enough space to host the entire extended Brooks clan with room to spare. As we walked through each perfectly decorated room, I found myself doing mental calculations. The mortgage alone had to be substantial, even with Tyler's income as a regional sales manager. Add in the furniture, the landscaping, the monthly expenses of maintaining a place like this, and the numbers started to feel overwhelming. But that was Tyler's business, not mine. I smiled and made appropriate comments about the crown molding and the granite countertops. I admired the master suite with its walk-in closet bigger than my bedroom and the guest bathroom with heated floors. I nodded appreciatively at the home office with its built-in bookshelves and the media room with its enormous flat-screen television. This must have been quite an investment, I said carefully, as we finished the tour in the backyard, where a sparkling pool reflected the Texas sky. Tyler's expression shifted slightly. Well, you know how it is. Sometimes you have to take risks to build the life you want. Vanessa and I were thinking long-term, building equity, creating a foundation for our future kids. There was something in his tone that made me wonder if everything was as solid as it appeared. But before I could ask any follow-up questions, Vanessa appeared at the sliding glass door, calling everyone in for the toast. The living room filled with family members, everyone holding glasses of champagne or wine. I accepted a glass of sparkling water, having learned years ago that alcohol at family gatherings only led to trouble. People arranged themselves in a loose circle, with Tyler and Vanessa at the center like the king and queen of their own little kingdom. Uncle Frank raised his glass first. To Tyler and Vanessa, for showing us all what hard work and determination can accomplish. This house is proof that the Brooks family knows how to succeed. Everyone murmured agreement and sipped their drinks. Cousin Derek chimed in with something about perseverance and following dreams. Vanessa blushed prettily and thanked everyone for their support and encouragement. It was all very warm and familial, the kind of moment that would look perfect in a Christmas card. Then my mother stepped forward, and I felt my stomach tighten. Patricia Brooks had a talent for turning any gathering into a performance, and I could see that gleam in her eye that meant she had something to say. "I want to add something," she began, her voice carrying that authority she had perfected over decades of running PTA meetings and charity committees. "Tyler and Vanessa, you two have built something incredible here. But more than that, you've shown what it means to be independent, to take care of yourselves without expecting handouts or help from family." She paused dramatically, letting her words sink in. Several people nodded along, though I noticed a few confused glances. Uncle Frank looked like he was trying to figure out where this was going. "It's refreshing," my mother continued, "to see young people who don't expect their parents or siblings to bail them out every time things get difficult, who don't come running to family every time they need money or support." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. I felt heat rising in my cheeks as I realized where this speech was headed. My mother's eyes found mine across the room, and her smile took on a sharp edge. "Some people," she said, her voice growing louder, "think that family means a free ride. They think that just because we share blood, everyone else should fund their poor decisions and irresponsible choices." Conversations died out completely. I could feel eyes turning toward me, and I wanted to disappear into the expensive hardwood floors. My father was staring at his shoes, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Tyler looked confused, glancing between our mother and me like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "Patricia," Uncle Frank said gently, "maybe this isn't the time." "Oh, it's exactly the time," my mother interrupted. "Because I'm tired of pretending that some people in this family contribute equally. I'm tired of watching my daughter take and take and take without ever giving anything back." The word daughter hung in the air like an accusation. I felt my chest tighten, my breathing shallow. This was happening. She was really doing this, here, in front of everyone. "I have never asked you for money," I said quietly, my voice barely audible over the sudden ringing in my ears. "Exactly," my mother exclaimed, as if I had just proved her point. "You never ask because you just expect it to appear. You expect us to cover your rent when you're between jobs. You expect us to pay for your car repairs and your medical bills and your student loan payments." The room was completely silent now except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of children playing in the pool next door. I felt like I was drowning in the middle of a perfectly decorated living room.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"You have never helped anyone but yourself," my mother declared, her voice ringing with finality. "You are selfish, ungrateful, and you have never contributed a single dollar to this family. All you do is take." Every eye in the room was on me. Cousin Derek's wife looked mortified. Uncle Frank appeared to be studying the pattern in the area rug. Tyler opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, then closed it again. Even Vanessa, who barely knew me, seemed uncomfortable with the level of public humiliation being inflicted. I stood there for a moment that felt like an eternity, my mother's words echoing in my head. Part of me wanted to run, to grab my purse and escape to my car and drive home to my small apartment where no one could hurt me with their words. Part of me wanted to scream, to let out all the frustration and pain that had been building for years. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking slightly, but my voice was steady when I spoke. "You want to talk about contributions?" I said, opening my banking app. "Let's talk about contributions." I had spent 3 years meticulously documenting every transaction, every payment, every transfer I had made to family members. Not because I was keeping score, but because I worked in finance, and I believed in maintaining accurate records. What had started as a professional habit had become a necessary protection against moments exactly like this one. "Let's start with Tyler's car payment," I said, scrolling through my transaction history. March 2022, when his Honda got totaled and he needed transportation to keep his job. I transferred $2,000 to help with the down payment on his current car. Tyler's face went pale. "Natalie, you don't have to." "Oh, but I do," I said, my voice gaining strength. "Because apparently I've never contributed anything to this family." I looked at my mother, whose expression had shifted from righteous anger to something approaching concern. "Should I continue? Because I have 3 years of records here." The silence stretched between us like a live wire. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the weight of 30 pairs of eyes watching this family drama unfold in real time. This wasn't how I had planned to spend my Saturday afternoon, but there was no turning back now. My mother's perfectly applied lipstick seemed to have lost its color. "Natalie," she said carefully, "there's no need to make a scene." "You made the scene," I replied. "I'm just providing the documentation." I continued scrolling through my phone, each transaction a small knife twist of memory. The money I had sent when Tyler lost his job for 2 months. The payment I had made directly to Vanessa's credit card company when they were struggling with debt from their wedding. The countless smaller amounts transferred for everything from birthday gifts for the nieces and nephews to contributions for family vacation rentals. But those were just the payments to Tyler. The real revelations were yet to come, and as I prepared to share them, I realized that this moment would change everything. Not just how my family saw me, but how I saw them. Sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. Sometimes it just shows you how trapped you really were. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across Tyler's perfect living room. In the golden light filtering through those expensive windows, surrounded by all the trappings of success and family togetherness, I was about to reveal 3 years' worth of secrets that would shatter everything my family believed about themselves. And there was no going back. The silence in Tyler's living room stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. I could feel the weight of 30 pairs of eyes boring into me as I stood there with my phone in hand, the screen glowing with 3 years of financial transactions that told a very different story than the one my mother had just painted. My finger hovered over the first entry I wanted to share. May 15th, 2023. The date was burned into my memory because it was the day after my mother had called me sobbing at 2 a.m, her voice thick with panic and shame. Dad's business was in trouble, real trouble, the kind that meant potential bankruptcy, losing the house, everything they had worked for over 30 years of marriage. "Let's talk about real contributions," I said, my voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence. May 15th, 2023. Emergency loan to Robert and Patricia Brooks. $15,000. My father's wine glass slipped from his fingers, hitting the hardwood floor with a sharp crack that made everyone jump. Red wine spread across the pristine white oak like blood, and for a moment that seemed more important than anything I had just said. Vanessa rushed to get towels, her heels clicking rapidly against the floor, while Tyler stared at our parents with an expression I couldn't quite read. "That's not," My mother started, then stopped. Her face had gone from pale to an alarming shade of gray. That was a loan. We paid you back. I scrolled down to show the screen to Uncle Frank, who was standing closest to me. Did you? Because according to my records, I'm still waiting for that payment. It's been 14 months. Uncle Frank squinted at my phone, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. That's a Chase Bank transfer, he said slowly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 40 years in accounting. $15,000 sent to an account under Robert Brooks. Date stamp shows May 15, 2023, 3:47 p.m. The room erupted in whispers. Cousin Derek leaned over to his wife, murmuring something that made her eyes widen. Vanessa had returned with paper towels and was frantically blotting at the wine stain, but I could tell she was listening to every word. Tyler stood frozen in the middle of it all, looking like someone had just told him that everything he believed about gravity was wrong. "Natalie," my father said, his voice hoarse. "We never asked you to bring that up here. That was private family business." "You're right," I replied, meeting his eyes directly. "It was private. Just like the conversation you had with Tyler last month when you told him I was irresponsible with money. Just like the conversation you had with Uncle Frank where you said I was a financial burden on the family." Uncle Frank shifted uncomfortably, confirming that those conversations had indeed taken place. I felt a stab of hurt, but I pushed it down. There would be time for processing emotions later. Right now, I needed to finish what my mother had started. But since Mom decided to make my financial contributions a public topic, I continued. Let's be thorough. I scrolled through my banking app, each transaction a memory I wished I could forget. The calls that always came late at night, when desperation made people brave enough to ask for help, they would pretend never happened in the daylight. The careful explanations about cash flow problems and temporary setbacks. The promises that it would never happen again, right up until the next time it happened. June 2023, I announced. Tyler's mortgage payment when he was between jobs. $2,800, sent directly to Wells Fargo. Tyler's face crumpled. "Nat, please, don't do this." July 2023, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each revelation. Emergency room bill for Mom when she didn't want Dad to know she'd been to the doctor. $847, paid directly to St. David's Medical Center. My mother's hand flew to her throat, her fingers playing with the delicate gold necklace she always wore. I remembered that night clearly. She had fallen down the stairs after having too much wine at book club, too proud to call Dad, too embarrassed to explain why she needed medical attention. I had driven across town at midnight, sat with her in the emergency room for 6 hours, and paid the bill without question because that's what family did for each other. August 2023, I said, the words coming easier now. Vanessa's student loan payment when the automatic payment got declined. $1,200. Vanessa stopped cleaning the wine stain and stared at me. "How did you know about that?" "Because Tyler called me in a panic at 6 in the morning," I replied. "He said your credit was going to be ruined if the payment didn't go through that day, and you didn't have the money because the wedding expenses had maxed out your cards." The whispers in the room grew louder. I could hear fragments of conversations, family members trying to piece together a pattern they had never noticed before. Cousin Derek was doing calculations on his phone, probably trying to figure out how much money I had lent to various family members over the years. September 2023, I announced. Uncle Frank's property tax payment when the city threatened to foreclose. $4,300. Uncle Frank's face turned red. "Now hold on a minute. That was an investment opportunity. I told you I would pay you back with interest." "Did you?" I asked, scrolling through my records. "Because I don't see any payments from you in my transaction history. What I do see is another request for money in November, when your tenant moved out and left you with property damage." The room fell silent again, except for the sound of Vanessa's paper towels rubbing against the floor and the distant hum of the air conditioning. I could feel something shifting in the atmosphere, like the moment before a thunderstorm, when the air gets heavy and charged with electricity. My mother tried one more time to regain control of the situation. "These were all loans," she said firmly. "Family loans. We always intended to pay you back." "Really?" I asked, pulling up my notes app where I had documented not just the amounts but the conversations surrounding each transfer, because I have very detailed records of what was said when these requests were made. I cleared my throat and began reading from my phone. Quote, "Natalie, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't an emergency. This is just until Dad gets the insurance settlement. You know we're good for it. That was you, Mom, on May 15th. The insurance settlement you were referring to was for Dad's fender bender that happened 6 months earlier. The settlement that came through in March, 2 months before you called me." My mother's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. I could see her trying to formulate a response, but the specific details made denial impossible. "Or how about this one?" I continued, scrolling to another note. Quote, "Tyler really screwed up this time, but we can't let him lose the house. Vanessa doesn't know how bad it is. Can you help us keep this quiet?" That was Dad asking me to cover Tyler's mortgage because Tyler had hidden their financial problems from his own wife. Tyler made a sound that was somewhere between a groan and a sigh. Vanessa stopped pretending to clean the wine stain and sat back on her heels, staring at her husband with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "I kept detailed records," I said, "because I work in finance and documentation is important. But also because I noticed a pattern. Every request came with a story about why it was an emergency, why it was temporary, why it would never happen again. And every single time, within a few months, there was another emergency." I looked around the room at faces that had become increasingly uncomfortable. These were people who had heard my mother's speech about my selfishness and lack of contribution. People who had nodded along when she painted me as the family burden. Now they were seeing bank statements and hearing recorded facts that told a completely different story. "October 2023, I continued. Cousin Derek's car repair when his transmission died. $600. November 2023, Dad's business loan payment when the bank threatened to call in the debt. $3,000. December 2023, Christmas gifts for all the nieces and nephews because, quote, money is tight this year, but we can't disappoint the kids. Each revelation felt like pulling a thread that unraveled more of the fabric that held our family's narrative together. I could see people doing mental math, adding up amounts, realizing that the family member they had dismissed as selfish had been quietly funding everyone else's emergencies for years. Cousin Derek's wife leaned over and whispered something to him that made him wince. Uncle Frank was studying his shoes like they contained the secrets of the universe. Even some of the extended family members who barely knew me were looking at my parents with questions in their eyes. January 2024. I said, my voice steady despite the emotion building in my chest. Emergency dental work for Mom when her crown fell out and she didn't want to wait for insurance approval. $900. February 2024. Tyler's credit card payment to avoid late fees. $500. March 2024. Gas and electric bill for Mom and Dad when the budget got tight after Dad's client didn't pay their invoice on time. The pattern was undeniable now. Month after month of requests, each one presented as an emergency, each one paid without question, each one forgotten as soon as the crisis passed. I had become the family's invisible safety net, catching everyone when they fell but never getting credit for keeping them from hitting the ground. April 2024. I continued. Vanessa's medical bills from her procedure that wasn't fully covered by insurance. $1,200 paid directly to the clinic because you were embarrassed about the payment plan they offered. Vanessa made a small sound, somewhere between surprise and embarrassment. I thought Tyler handled that, she said quietly. Tyler called me, I replied. He said you were stressed about the bills affecting your credit score, so I took care of it. The room was completely silent now except for the sound of my own voice reading from a record that nobody else had been keeping. I realized that this was the first time many of these family members were hearing about each other's financial struggles. We had all been keeping secrets, maintaining the illusion of success while quietly struggling behind closed doors. May 2024, I said, my voice beginning to crack slightly. Mother's Day gift for Mom because she mentioned that Dad couldn't afford to take her somewhere nice this year. Dinner at Uchi, flowers, wine. $350. My mother's eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't tell if they were tears of shame or anger or something else entirely. She had gushed about that dinner for weeks, telling everyone how thoughtful and generous Dad had been, how lucky she was to have a husband who still made such romantic gestures after 35 years of marriage. June 2024. I continued, each word feeling heavier than the last. Tyler's family vacation to Galveston, when the original trip to Colorado had to be canceled because of money problems. Condo rental, gas money, spending cash. $2,000. Tyler looked like he wanted to disappear into the expensive hardwood floors. The kids were so disappointed about Colorado, he said weakly. We just wanted to give them something. I know, I replied, and I did know. I had seen the devastation on my niece's face when the original trip was canceled. I had heard Tyler's voice crack when he called to ask for help, the sound of a father who felt like he was failing his children. That's why I didn't hesitate to help. I scrolled further down my transaction history, each entry a small knife twist of memory. The late-night phone calls filled with shame and desperation. The careful explanations of temporary setbacks and unexpected expenses. The promises of repayment that evaporated as soon as the immediate crisis passed. July 2024. I announced. Emergency vet bill for Uncle Frank's dog when she got into chocolate. $400. August 2024. School clothes for Derek's kids when his bonus got delayed. $600. September 2024. Car insurance payment for Dad when the automatic payment bounced. Uncle Frank cleared his throat. Natalie, we appreciate everything you've done, but maybe this isn't the time or place. When is the time? I interrupted, looking directly at him. When Mom publicly accuses me of never helping family. When she tells everyone I'm selfish and ungrateful. When exactly would be the appropriate time to defend myself with facts? The question hung in the air like a challenge. I could see people shifting uncomfortably, realizing that they had been complicit in a narrative that was not only false but cruel. They had listened to my mother disparage me, without ever asking for my side of the story. They had assumed that her version of events was accurate without ever examining the evidence. October 2024. I continued, my voice gaining strength again. Tyler's car payment when his commission check was smaller than expected. $450. November 2024. Just 3 weeks ago, Mom's prescription medications when the insurance company denied coverage. $230. Each transaction was a story of trust betrayed, of help given freely and then denied or forgotten. I had become the family's secret weapon against financial disaster, but instead of gratitude, I had received judgment and criticism. Instead of acknowledgement, I had received accusations of selfishness. The silence stretched between us like a chasm that couldn't be bridged with words. I could see my family members processing this information, trying to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the evidence displayed on my phone screen. Some looked ashamed. Others looked confused. A few looked angry, though I wasn't sure if the anger was directed at me for exposing the truth or at themselves for believing the lies. My mother finally found her voice. Those were private matters, she said. Her tone defensive but weaker than before. Family business that didn't need to be aired in public. You made it public, I replied simply. You stood up in front of everyone and accused me of never helping anyone but myself. You called me selfish and ungrateful. You said I had never contributed a single dollar to this family. I'm just providing the documentation that proves otherwise. I looked around the room at faces I had known my entire life. People who had celebrated my birthdays and graduations, who had been present for holidays and family milestones, who I thought knew me well enough to question my mother's characterization of who I was and what I had done for our family. The total, I said, scrolling to the bottom of my transaction history, for the past 3 years of emergency loans, bill payments, and financial assistance provided to various family members, comes to $43,712. The number landed in the room like a physical blow. I heard someone gasp, though I couldn't tell who. Cousin Derek dropped his phone, the sound of it hitting the floor sharp in the sudden silence. Even the children playing outside seemed to have gone quiet, as if the weight of revelation had somehow reached beyond the walls of this perfect house. $43,000, I repeated, letting the amount sink in. That's more than most people make in a year. That's money I could have used for a down payment on a house, or to pay off my student loans early, or to build an emergency fund for my own unexpected expenses. I could see people doing calculations in their heads, adding up their own requests, realizing how much I had sacrificed for family members who had then allowed me to be publicly humiliated without saying a word in my defense. But the money wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the pattern of behavior that had made this moment possible. The way financial assistance had been requested in crisis and then forgotten in comfort. The way I had been painted as irresponsible and selfish by the very people whose lives I had helped stabilize. The way my family had allowed my character to be assassinated while knowing full well that none of it was true. And this was only part 2 of a story that was about to get much more complicated. Because the payment history was just the beginning. The real revelations were still coming, and they would change everything we thought we knew about loyalty, family, and the price of keeping secrets. The $43,000 figure hung in the air like smoke from a fire nobody wanted to acknowledge. I watched as the reality of what I had just revealed settled over the room like a heavy blanket, suffocating the carefully maintained illusions that had been protecting everyone's pride for years. Uncle Frank was the first to break the silence, his accounting background making him process numbers faster than everyone else. "Natalie," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, "that's more than my annual property taxes. That's more than most people have in their emergency funds." I nodded, keeping my phone screen visible so anyone who wanted to verify the information could see it for themselves. The banking app didn't lie. Numbers didn't have emotions or agendas. They simply existed, marking the trail of financial assistance that had flowed quietly from my accounts to theirs for 3 years, without recognition or gratitude. But as I stood there watching my family grapple with the mathematical proof of their hypocrisy, I realized that the money itself wasn't the real story. The real story was what those transactions represented, and why they had been necessary in the first place. The real story was about a family that had built its identity on success and independence, while secretly depending on the financial stability of the member they publicly dismissed as irresponsible. "There's something else," I said, my voice cutting through the murmured conversations that had started around the room. "Something I think y'all need to understand about why these requests kept coming." I scrolled to a different app on my phone, one that I used for tracking investments and financial planning. Over the past 3 years, I hadn't just been documenting the money going out. I had been tracking patterns, analyzing spending habits, and trying to understand why the same people kept having the same financial emergencies over and over again. "Mom," I said, looking directly at her for the first time since this confrontation began, "do you want to tell everyone about the credit cards?" Her face went completely white. She gripped the back of Tyler's leather sofa so tightly that her knuckles matched the color of her skin. "Natalie, don't. Or should I explain about Dad's business loan that wasn't really for business purposes?" I continued, my voice steady despite the way my heart was hammering against my ribs. "The one that was actually used to pay off the gambling debts from his weekly poker games?" My father made a sound like he had been punched in the stomach. Several family members turned to stare at him with expressions of shock and confusion. Uncle Frank took a step backward, as if physical distance could somehow protect him from this revelation. "That's enough," my mother said sharply, but her voice cracked on the words. "You're embarrassing the family." "I'm telling the truth," I replied. "There's a difference." I had spent months piecing together the real financial picture of my family members, not out of nosiness or malice, but out of genuine concern. When someone asks you for emergency money every few months, patterns start to emerge. When the same types of crises keep happening to the same people, you begin to wonder if they're really emergencies or symptoms of deeper problems. "Tyler," I said, turning to my brother, "how much do you and Vanessa actually owe on credit cards right now?" He opened his mouth, then closed it, looking like a fish gasping for air. Vanessa was still sitting on the floor next to the wine stain, but she had stopped pretending to clean it. Her face had gone pale, and she was staring at her husband with an expression I couldn't quite read. Because according to the credit monitoring service I pay for, I continued, which includes family member alerts that you signed up for 3 years ago when you were trying to rebuild your score, you currently owe approximately $67,000 across 8 different credit cards. The gasp that went up from the room was audible. Cousin Derek's wife actually covered her mouth with her hand. Even the teenagers who had been hovering around the edges of the conversation perked up at this revelation. "That's impossible," Vanessa said, finally finding her voice. "We only have 3 cards, and they're nowhere near maxed out." I looked at Tyler, whose expression confirmed what I already knew from the credit reports. "Do you want to tell her, or should I?" Tyler looked like he was going to be sick. The confident, successful image he had been projecting all afternoon crumbled in real time as he faced the choice between confessing to his wife or having me expose his lies in front of the entire extended family. "I opened some additional accounts," he said quietly, not meeting Vanessa's eyes. "When we were planning the wedding, and then the house, there were expenses that came up. I didn't want you to worry." "Additional accounts?" Vanessa's voice rose an octave. "How many additional accounts?" The room was completely silent except for the sound of Tyler's labored breathing and the distant hum of the air conditioning. I could see people leaning forward, drawn into this family drama despite themselves. This wasn't just entertainment anymore. This was the complete dismantling of everything they thought they knew about the successful, responsible Brooks family. 5, Tyler whispered. 5 additional cards. Vanessa stood up so quickly that she almost lost her balance. 5. Tyler, what have you done? I watched this conversation unfold with a mixture of sadness and vindication. These were the same people who had stood quietly while my mother accused me of being financially irresponsible. These were the people who had nodded along when she painted me as selfish and ungrateful. Now they were seeing the real financial picture, and it wasn't pretty. "Uncle Frank," I said, deciding to complete the picture, "would you like to explain to everyone why you really needed $4,000 for property taxes? Because property tax records are public, and your house shows a total annual tax burden of $2,700. Uncle Frank's face turned red, then purple. "That's none of your business, young lady." "You made it my business when you asked me for money," I replied calmly. "Just like you made it my business when you told the family I was irresponsible with money while you were using my loan to cover gambling losses at the boat casino." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Uncle Frank had always been the family's voice of financial wisdom, the one who lectured everyone else about fiscal responsibility and planning for the future. The idea that he had been gambling away money while borrowing from his niece was too much for some people to process. "This is ridiculous," Cousin Derek said, stepping forward like he was going to defend Uncle Frank. "These are private family matters that don't belong in public discussion." I turned to look at him, remembering the urgency in his voice when he had called me 6 months ago, desperate for money to cover his son's medical bills. "Would you prefer I discuss your private matters instead, Derek? Like the health insurance you let lapse because you thought you could save money by going without coverage?" Derek's wife grabbed his arm, her face a mask of horror and embarrassment. Their son had broken his leg in a skateboarding accident, and the emergency room visit had cost them thousands of dollars they didn't have. Derek had called me in tears, begging for help, promising to pay me back as soon as his next commission check came through. "Or maybe we should talk about why your commission checks have been smaller lately," I continued, my voice gaining momentum as years of suppressed frustration finally found an outlet. "The client accounts you've been neglecting because you've been spending your work hours day trading cryptocurrency." The pattern was becoming clearer with each revelation. This wasn't a family that occasionally faced unexpected expenses. This was a family of people who consistently made poor financial decisions, and then expected me to cover the consequences while publicly maintaining the fiction that they were responsible and successful. "Stop," my mother said, her voice sharp with desperation. "Just stop. You're destroying this family." "I'm not destroying anything," I replied, my voice steady and calm. "I'm just refusing to keep your secrets anymore." I looked around the room at faces that had become increasingly uncomfortable. These people had come to Tyler's housewarming party expecting to celebrate success and family togetherness. Instead, they were witnessing the complete dismantling of the Brooks family mythology, one financial transaction at a time. The truth is, I said, addressing the room as a whole. I've been functioning as this family's private bank for 3 years. Not because I wanted to, not because I was asked nicely, but because I was emotionally manipulated into believing that family loyalty meant covering everyone else's poor decisions without question or recognition. I scrolled through my phone to another app, one that tracked my own financial goals and progress. Do you want to know what $43,000 could have meant for my future? I could have paid off my student loans 2 years early. I could have saved for a house down payment. I could have invested in my retirement fund, or taken the vacation I've been putting off for 5 years. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. This one felt heavier, more loaded with guilt and recognition. People were starting to understand that my financial assistance hadn't just been generous family support. It had come at a real cost to my own financial security and future planning. But instead, I continued, I've been subsidizing everyone else's lifestyle choices while being told that I'm the irresponsible one. I've been paying for Dad's gambling debts while listening to lectures about fiscal responsibility. I've been covering Tyler's credit card payments while being told I don't understand the value of money. Tyler finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Nat, we never meant for it to happen like this. It wasn't supposed to be a pattern. But it was a pattern, I replied. A very clear pattern. Crisis, phone call, emotional manipulation, financial assistance, promises of repayment, silence until the next crisis. Over and over again for 3 years. I had documentation for all of it. Not just the bank transfers and payment confirmations, but recordings of some of the phone calls where family members had begged for help. Screenshots of text messages where they had promised this was the last time they would ever ask. Email chains where they had outlined repayment plans that were never honored. I started recording conversations and saving messages after the first year, I said, because I noticed that people's stories kept changing. The emergency that was supposed to last 2 weeks turned into a permanent situation. The temporary loan became an indefinite arrangement. The grateful family member became someone who acted like I had never helped them at all. Vanessa had been silent throughout most of these revelations, but now she spoke up, her voice small and confused. Tyler, is all of this true? The credit cards, the money from Natalie, the lies about our finances. Tyler couldn't meet her eyes. He stared at the floor, his shoulders shaking with what might have been sobs or just overwhelming shame. The successful, confident persona he had been projecting all afternoon had completely evaporated, leaving behind a man who looked broken and defeated. Answer me, Vanessa said, her voice growing stronger. I deserve to know the truth about our marriage, our finances, our life together. Yes, Tyler whispered. It's all true. The admission hung in the air like a confession in church, heavy with the weight of betrayal and broken trust. Vanessa stared at her husband for a long moment, then looked around the room at all the family members who had apparently known more about her financial situation than she did. How many of you knew? She asked, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. How many of you knew that my husband was lying to me about our debt while borrowing money from his sister? The uncomfortable shifting that followed answered her question more clearly than words could have. People studied their shoes, examined the artwork on Tyler's walls, found sudden interest in their phone screens. Nobody wanted to admit that they had been complicit in keeping secrets that affected her marriage and financial security. Everyone, Vanessa said, the realization dawning in her voice. Everyone knew except me. I felt a stab of sympathy for her, despite everything. Vanessa might have benefited from my financial assistance, but she had clearly been kept in the dark about the extent of their problems. She was as much a victim of this family's dysfunction as I was, just in a different way. I'm sorry, I said, addressing her directly. I assumed you knew. Tyler always made it sound like you were both aware of the situation and working together to address it. Working together? Vanessa's laugh was bitter and sharp. I'd been living in a fantasy while everyone else knew the truth about my life. She She stood up and walked to the sliding glass door that led to the backyard, staring out at the pool and the perfectly landscaped yard that I now realized had probably been financed with credit cards and family loans. The American dream they had been living was built on debt and deception, held together by my financial assistants and everyone else's willingness to keep secrets. "There's more," I said quietly, though part of me wanted to stop there. The devastation in the room was already overwhelming, and I knew that what I was about to reveal would make everything worse. But I had come this far, and the truth deserved to be complete. My family had spent 3 years painting me as the problem while hiding the real issues that were destroying them from the inside. If we were going to have this conversation, it needed to include everything. 3 weeks ago, I said, I was contacted by a financial advisor who wanted to discuss some unusual activity on accounts connected to my credit report. The room went completely still. Even Vanessa turned away from the window to look at me, her expression wary and afraid. It seems that someone had been using my personal information to apply for credit cards and small loans, I continued, my voice steady despite the way my hands were shaking. Someone who had access to my social security number, my employment information, and my banking details. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the weight of 30 pairs of eyes watching me as I prepared to drop the final bomb that would destroy whatever remained of our family relationships. Someone who had been using my credit to cover their own financial mistakes, while simultaneously telling everyone that I was irresponsible with money. The accusation hung in the air like a live wire, dangerous and electric. I didn't name names. I didn't point fingers. I just let the implications settle over the room while I watched faces change, from confusion to understanding to horror. Because identity theft wasn't just a financial crime. It was a betrayal of trust so profound that it could never be undone. And everyone in that room was about to learn exactly who in our family was capable of that level of deception. The words identity theft echoed through Tyler's living room like a gunshot, leaving behind a ringing silence that seemed to stretch forever. I watched as comprehension dawned on different faces at different speeds, some people immediately understanding the implications, while others struggled to process what I had just suggested. The weight of the accusation settled over the room like a heavy fog, making it difficult to breathe. My mother was the first to react, her face cycling through emotions so quickly that I could barely track them. Shock gave way to fear, fear transformed into anger, and anger crystallized into the cold fury I had seen so many times throughout my childhood when she felt cornered or exposed. "That's a very serious accusation, Natalie," she said, her voice taking on the tone she used to use when I was in trouble as a child. "I hope you have proof before you start making wild claims about criminal behavior." I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila envelope that I had been carrying for 3 weeks, ever since my meeting with the financial advisor who had first alerted me to the suspicious activity. Inside were printed copies of credit applications, loan documents, and bank account opening forms, all bearing my personal information but signed with handwriting that wasn't mine. "I do have proof," I said calmly, opening the envelope and spreading the documents across Tyler's coffee table. Multiple applications for credit cards, a personal loan from a payday lending company, and 2 checking accounts opened at different banks, all using my name, my social security number, my employment information, and my address. Uncle Frank leaned forward to examine the papers, his accounting background making him the most qualified person in the room to analyze financial documents. His face grew increasingly grim as he studied each page, comparing signatures and noting discrepancies. "These applications span the last 18 months, he said slowly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. "The handwriting is consistent across all documents, but it's definitely not Natalie's signature. I've seen her sign enough birthday cards to recognize her handwriting." The room erupted in whispers and gasps. Cousin Derek's wife actually stepped backward, as if physical distance could protect her from being associated with whatever revelation was coming next. Even some of the teenagers who had been hovering around the edges of the conversation seemed to understand that they were witnessing something serious and potentially criminal. "The total amount of credit obtained using my information," I continued, my voice steady despite the way my heart was racing, is approximately $27,000. All of it maxed out, all of it in default, all of it destroying my credit score while I had no idea it was happening. Vanessa made a small sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. She was still standing by the sliding glass door, but now she looked like she was using the wall for support. The perfect life she thought she had been living was disintegrating in real time, and I could see her trying to process how much of her reality had been built on lies and fraud. "The financial advisor who contacted me," I said, pulling out another document from the envelope, "was able to trace the pattern of applications to a specific location, someone who had regular access to my personal information, someone who knew my employment details and financial history, someone who could forge documents convincingly enough to fool multiple lending institutions." I looked around the room, making eye contact with each family member as I spoke. Someone who had been in my apartment enough times to photograph important documents. Someone who had access to my mail when I was out of town. Someone I trusted completely. The silence that followed was suffocating. I could hear the air conditioning cycling on and off, could hear children playing in a neighbor's yard, could hear the distant sound of traffic on the main road, but inside Tyler's perfect living room, nobody seemed to be breathing. My father cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the sudden quiet. "Natalie, surely you don't think that anyone in this family would—" "The applications were submitted from an IP address," I interrupted, pulling out another page from the envelope. "The same IP address, every single time. An address that the technology investigator was able to trace to a specific location in Austin." I held up the paper so everyone could see the highlighted address at the top of the page. It was typed in official-looking font, with timestamps and technical information that looked legitimate and official. 1247 Maple Street, Austin, Texas, 78703. I read aloud, the home address of Robert and Patricia Brooks. The explosion of sound that followed was immediate and chaotic. People started talking all at once, voices overlapping and rising as the full implication of what I had just revealed hit the room like a physical blow. Uncle Frank stood up so quickly that he knocked over his wine glass, adding to the mess on Tyler's expensive hardwood floors. Cousin Derek started backing toward the door like he was planning to leave before things got worse. My mother's face had gone completely white, then flushed red, then settled into a pale gray that made her look genuinely ill. She gripped the back of the sofa so tightly that her knuckles stood out like mountain peaks against her skin. "That doesn't prove anything," she said, but her voice cracked on the words. "IP addresses can be spoofed. Anyone could have used our internet connection. This is all circumstantial evidence." I reached into the envelope one more time and pulled out what I had been saving for last. A photograph taken by a security camera at a payday lending office, showing someone entering the building with a folder of documents. The timestamp showed a date from 6 months ago, and the face in the photograph was clearly recognizable despite the baseball cap and sunglasses. "This is from the security footage at Quick Cash Loans on South Lamar," I said, holding up the photograph so everyone could see it. "The same day that someone applied for a $3,000 loan using my personal information." The photograph showed my father walking into the payday lending office, carrying a manila folder and looking around nervously like he was worried about being seen. The image quality was clear enough to identify him unmistakably, and the timestamp correlated perfectly with one of the fraudulent loan applications. The room went completely silent except for the sound of my mother's sharp intake of breath. Even the teenagers stopped whispering and stared at the photograph with wide eyes. Uncle Frank sat down heavily in the nearest chair, looking like someone had just told him that everything he believed about gravity was wrong. "Dad," Tyler said, his voice barely above a whisper, "please tell me this isn't what it looks like." My father opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again without making any sound. He looked like a man who had been caught in a lie so comprehensive that he couldn't figure out where to begin explaining himself. His eyes darted around the room seeking escape routes or allies, but finding neither. "It wasn't supposed to affect your credit," he finally said, his voice so quiet that people had to lean forward to hear him. "The guy at the loan office said that as long as the payments were made on time, it wouldn't show up on your report." The admission hit the room like a bomb. Several people gasped audibly. Vanessa slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, staring at my father with an expression of complete disbelief. Even some of the extended family members who barely knew the details of our relationships seemed to understand that they had just witnessed a confession to a serious crime. "You lied to them about the reporting," Uncle Frank said, his accountant's mind immediately grasping the financial implications. "Or they lied to you. Either way, identity theft affects the victim's credit, regardless of payment history." My father's face crumpled as the reality of what he had done began to sink in. "I was desperate," he said, his voice breaking. "The business was failing, the poker debts were mounting up, your mother was threatening to leave me if she found out how bad things had gotten. So you decided to commit fraud using your daughter's identity," I said, my voice surprisingly calm given the magnitude of what I had just learned. "You decided to steal from me rather than face the consequences of your own poor decisions." The weight of those words seemed to crush him. He sank into one of Tyler's expensive chairs and put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with what might have been sobs or just overwhelming shame. "How long?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. "How long has this been going on?" 18 months, my mother said suddenly, her voice flat and mechanical. "It started 18 months ago when the business loan got called in early and we didn't have the money to cover it." The confession came out of her like water from a broken dam, 18 months of secrets and lies spilling into Tyler's living room, where they could never be taken back or hidden again. "We tried everything else first," she continued, her voice growing stronger as she seemed to find relief in finally telling the truth. "We applied for legitimate loans, tried to refinance the house, asked banks for extensions on existing debt. Nothing worked. Your father's credit was already too damaged from the gambling, and mine wasn't much better." I listened to this explanation with a mixture of horror and fascination. These were the same people who had lectured me about financial responsibility for years. These were the people who had criticized my spending habits and questioned my ability to manage money. And all the while, they had been systematically stealing my identity to cover their own financial disasters. "So you decided to use mine," I said. Not really a question, but a statement of fact. "We were going to pay everything back," my father said, finally lifting his head to look at me. "Every penny. With interest. We just needed time to get back on our feet." 18 months, I repeated. "You've been destroying my credit for 18 months while telling everyone that I'm irresponsible with money." The irony was so profound that it would have been funny if it weren't so devastating. While I had been quietly lending them legitimate money to cover their emergencies, they had been secretly borrowing additional money in my name to cover expenses they were too ashamed to admit they couldn't handle. "The credit cards maxed out immediately," my mother said, her confession continuing like she couldn't stop herself now that she had started. "We told ourselves it was temporary, just until your father's client paid the outstanding invoice. But then there were other expenses, other emergencies, other gambling losses," I said, my voice cutting through her explanation like a knife. She flinched but didn't deny it. "The loan payments started coming due, and we didn't have the money. That's when we started asking you for help with our legitimate expenses, thinking we could use your loans to cover the fraudulent debt payments." The complexity of their deception was staggering. They had been juggling legitimate loans from me, with fraudulent loans taken in my name, using my financial assistance to make payments on accounts I didn't know existed, all while maintaining the fiction that they were responsible adults who occasionally faced unexpected emergencies. "Every time you helped us," my father said, his voice thick with shame, "we told ourselves it proved that the fraud was justified. We were going to pay you back anyway, so what difference did it make if some of that money went to cover the accounts we opened in your name?" I stared at him, trying to process the mental gymnastics required to reach that conclusion. They had convinced themselves that my voluntary financial assistance somehow retroactively justified their theft of my identity. They had used my generosity as evidence that their crimes were acceptable. "The credit monitoring alerts?" I said, remembering the emails I had been receiving for months. "You were intercepting them." My mother nodded miserably. "You had mail forwarded to our house when you were traveling for work last year. We kept the forwarding active longer than we should have, and when the credit monitoring emails started coming, we deleted them before you could see them." Another layer of deception, another betrayal of trust. They had been actively working to keep me from discovering their crimes, using their access to my mail and my trust in them as family members to cover their tracks. The financial advisor who contacted me, I said, only reached out because one of the payday loans went into collections and they couldn't reach me at the address on file. When they called my actual phone number, that's when everything started unraveling. Uncle Frank was shaking his head slowly, his face a mask of disbelief and disgust. The damage to Natalie's credit score alone could take years to repair. And that's assuming all the fraudulent accounts can be successfully disputed. The practical implications were starting to sink in for everyone in the room. This wasn't just a family squabble about money or hurt feelings. This was a serious crime, with long-term consequences that could affect my ability to buy a house, get a car loan, or even rent an apartment in some cases. "I trusted you," I said, my voice finally beginning to crack as the full emotional impact of their betrayal hit me. "I gave you money when you asked for it. I never questioned your emergencies or demanded proof of your expenses. I helped you because you're my family, and I believed that's what family does for each other." The silence that followed was heavy with guilt and recognition. Everyone in the room could see the contrast between my behavior and theirs. I had given freely and openly while they had taken secretly and criminally. I had trusted completely while they had betrayed systematically. "We were going to tell you," my mother said weakly. "Once we got everything sorted out and paid off, we were going to explain what had happened and make sure your credit was restored." "When?" I asked. "When exactly were you planning to tell me? After you had ruined my credit completely? After I was denied for a mortgage or a car loan? When was the right time to confess to 18 months of identity theft?" She couldn't answer because there was no good answer. They had never intended to tell me. They had been hoping to resolve everything secretly and bury the evidence of their crimes along with their shame. Vanessa finally spoke up from her position on the floor by the sliding glass door. "This explains so much," she said, her voice hollow and distant. "The mysterious phone calls, the secretive meetings, the way Tyler started acting so paranoid about money and mail and privacy settings." She looked at her husband with an expression that was part betrayal and part revelation. "You knew about this. You helped them hide it from me and from Natalie." Tyler couldn't meet her eyes. "I didn't know the details," he said miserably. "I knew they were having financial problems that were worse than they were admitting, but I didn't know about the identity theft until a few months ago." "A few months ago," Vanessa repeated. "And you said nothing. You let your sister continue lending money to people who were simultaneously stealing from her, and you said nothing." The complicity was spreading through the room like a virus, infecting everyone who had known pieces of the truth but chosen to remain silent. Uncle Frank had known about the gambling. Cousin Derek had suspected that the financial emergencies were more serious than they appeared. Even some of the extended family members had heard whispers about money problems that seemed inconsistent with the lifestyle my parents were maintaining. "How many of you knew?" I asked, addressing the room as a whole. "How many of you knew that something wasn't right but chose to stay quiet rather than warn me?" The uncomfortable shifting that followed provided its own answer. People studied their shoes, examined their phones, found sudden interest in Tyler's artwork. Nobody wanted to admit that they had been protecting the perpetrators while allowing the victim to continue being victimized. "All of you," I said, the realization settling over me like a heavy blanket. "Every single one of you knew something was wrong, but nobody said anything to me." The betrayal was complete now, extending far beyond my parents to include nearly everyone I had considered family. They had all been complicit in keeping secrets that had allowed the fraud to continue, while I remained unaware that my identity was being systematically stolen and my credit destroyed. But this was only the beginning of the consequences that would flow from 18 months of crime and deception. Because identity theft wasn't just a family matter that could be resolved with apologies and promises. It was a federal crime with serious legal implications, and the authorities were already involved whether my family realized it or not. The silence that followed my father's confession stretched like a canyon between us, deep and seemingly impossible to cross. I stood there in Tyler's perfect living room, surrounded by the scattered evidence of 18 months of identity theft, watching my family grapple with the reality that their secrets had finally been exposed. The weight of betrayal sat heavy in my chest, but underneath it, something else was growing. Something that felt like clarity. I carefully gathered the documents from the coffee table, sliding each piece of evidence back into the manila envelope with deliberate precision. My hands were steady now, my breathing calm. The emotional storm that had been building for 3 years was finally breaking, and in its wake, I found something I hadn't expected to feel in this moment. Relief. "Natalie," my mother said, her voice tentative and pleading. "We need to talk about how to fix this. As a family, we can work together to resolve everything, restore your credit, make this right." I looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years. I saw the desperation in her eyes, the fear of consequences, the hope that family loyalty would somehow override the magnitude of what she and my father had done. I saw a woman who was still trying to control the narrative, still trying to make this about family obligations rather than criminal behavior. "No," I said simply. "We can't." The word landed in the room like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled family members. Uncle Frank raised his eyebrows. Cousin Derek's wife took another step toward the door. Even Tyler looked surprised, as if he had expected me to somehow absorb this betrayal the way I had absorbed every other disappointment and manipulation over the years. "What do you mean, no?" my mother asked, her voice rising slightly. "Natalie, we're family. Families work through problems together. We don't involve outsiders in private matters." I almost laughed at the irony. After 18 months of systematically destroying my financial future while publicly humiliating me for being irresponsible, she was appealing to family loyalty. After committing federal crimes using my identity, she was worried about involving outsiders. "You involved outsiders the moment you walked into that payday loan office," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You involved outsiders when you applied for credit cards in my name. You involved outsiders when you opened bank accounts using my social security number. This stopped being a private family matter the day you decided to commit identity theft." My father finally looked up from his hands, his face red and streaked with tears. "Natalie, please. If you report this, it will destroy our lives. I could go to prison. Your mother could lose her job. Think about what you're doing to your own family." The manipulation was so familiar, so practiced, that I could hear the echo of every guilt trip they had used on me throughout my childhood. The implication that I was responsible for protecting them from the consequences of their own actions. The suggestion that my refusal to enable their behavior made me the cruel one, the family destroyer. "I didn't do anything to my family," I replied. "You did this. You chose to commit crimes rather than face your problems honestly. You chose to steal from me rather than ask for help directly. You chose to let me lend you legitimate money while you were simultaneously stealing my identity to borrow more." Vanessa had been silent throughout this exchange, but now she stood up from her position by the sliding glass door. Her face was pale but determined, and when she spoke, her voice was stronger than I had heard it all afternoon. "Tyler?" she said, looking directly at her husband. "We need to talk. Privately. Right now." Tyler opened his mouth like he was going to protest, but something in Vanessa's expression stopped him. He nodded miserably and followed her toward the stairs that led to the second floor of their house. I watched them go, wondering if their marriage would survive the revelations of this afternoon. Wondering if any of our relationships would. Uncle Frank cleared his throat, breaking the uncomfortable silence that had settled over the room. "Natalie," he said carefully, "I think we all need to understand what you're planning to do with this information." I looked around at the faces of my extended family, people who had known me since I was a child, people who had celebrated my birthdays and graduations, people who had stood silently while my mother publicly humiliated me less than an hour ago. People who had known pieces of the truth, but chosen to protect the perpetrators instead of warning the victim. "I've already filed a police report," I said, my voice steady despite the gasps that rose from around the room. "I filed it 3 days ago, after my meeting with the financial advisor confirmed that the identity theft was ongoing and extensive." The explosion of sound that followed was immediate and chaotic. Several people started talking at once, voices rising in panic and disbelief. My mother sank into the nearest chair like her legs had given out. My father made a sound that was somewhere between a moan and a cry. "You called the police?" Cousin Derek asked, his voice cracking slightly. Without talking to us first? Without giving them a chance to explain? I turned to look at him, remembering the urgency in his voice when he had called me for money 6 months ago, the tears and the promises, and the gratitude that had evaporated the moment his crisis passed. I gave them 3 years of chances, I said. 3 years of legitimate loans, covered emergencies, paid bills, and financial assistance. 3 years of being told I was irresponsible while they were systematically destroying my credit. 3 years of being called selfish while I subsidized their lifestyle choices. The truth of it hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore or explain away. Every person in that room had benefited from my financial assistance at some point, and every person in that room had remained silent, while my character was assassinated by the very people who were committing crimes in my name. The detective assigned to my case, I continued, told me that identity theft cases with this level of documentation and evidence usually result in felony charges, especially when the perpetrators are repeat offenders who have shown a pattern of financial fraud. My father's face crumpled completely at the word felony. The reality of what he was facing seemed to hit him all at once: criminal charges, potential prison time, the complete destruction of the respectable image he had spent decades building. Natalie, my mother pleaded, think about your nieces and nephews. Think about what this will do to them when their grandfather is arrested. Think about the family reputation, the business, everything we've built together. The appeal to my concern for the children was particularly cruel, and I felt a flash of anger that cut through my carefully maintained composure. These were the same children whose Christmas gifts I had funded when money was supposedly tight. The same children whose medical bills and school expenses I had helped cover when their parents faced financial emergencies. I am thinking about them, I said. I'm thinking about what kind of family we're modeling for them when we cover up crimes and protect people who steal from their own relatives. I'm thinking about what we're teaching them about accountability and consequences. Uncle Frank had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up, his voice heavy with resignation. How long do we have before the arrests happen? The question sent a new wave of panic through the room. People started looking around like they expected police officers to come through the door at any moment. The reality of criminal investigation was finally sinking in, and with it, the understanding that this situation was completely beyond their control now. The detective said they would probably make arrests within the next week, I replied. They want to coordinate with the financial institutions to ensure they have all the evidence they need for prosecution. My mother stood up abruptly, her face flushed with anger and desperation. You vindictive little brat, she spat, her careful composure finally cracking completely. After everything we've done for you, after raising you and supporting you and giving you a family, this is how you repay us? By destroying our lives over money? The words hit me like a slap, but not in the way she intended. Instead of hurt or guilt, I felt something like liberation. For the first time in my adult life, my mother was showing me exactly who she really was, without the careful facade of maternal concern or family loyalty. She was showing me that she valued her own comfort more than my financial security, her own reputation more than my trust, her own freedom more than the truth. Over money? I repeated, my voice growing stronger. This isn't about money, Mom. This is about 18 months of systematic fraud. This is about using my identity to commit crimes, while telling everyone I was irresponsible. This is about betraying every principle of trust and honesty that families are supposed to be built on. I looked around the room at the faces of my extended family, most of whom were avoiding eye contact now. And it's about all of you who knew something was wrong but chose to protect the perpetrators instead of warning me. It's about a family that values image more than integrity, secrets more than truth. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. This one felt final, like the moment when a bridge collapses and you realize there's no way to cross the gap anymore. I could see people processing the reality that our family relationships would never be the same after this afternoon. Footsteps on the stairs announced Tyler and Vanessa's return. When they reached the bottom, I could see that Vanessa had been crying, but her expression was resolute. Tyler looked like a man who had just received devastating news, which I supposed he had. I'm filing for divorce, Vanessa announced to the room, her voice clear and strong. I can't be married to someone who has been lying to me about our finances, our debt, and his family's criminal behavior. I can't build a life with someone I can't trust. Tyler didn't protest or try to argue. He just nodded miserably, accepting this consequence the way someone accepts a terminal diagnosis. The perfect life he had been projecting, the successful image he had been maintaining, was crumbling in real time. I'm also going to cooperate fully with the police investigation, Vanessa continued, looking directly at my parents. Tyler told me everything upstairs, including his knowledge of the identity theft and his role in helping to hide it from Natalie. I think the authorities should have all the information they need to understand the full scope of what happened. My mother made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. The circle of secrecy that had protected their crimes was completely shattered now, with even Tyler's own wife turning against them. There would be no family solidarity, no united front against outside investigation. I need to go, I said, gathering my purse and the envelope of evidence. I have an appointment with my attorney tomorrow morning to discuss the civil litigation options for recovering damages from the identity theft. The mention of civil litigation sent a new wave of panic through the room. Criminal charges were one thing, but the possibility of financial lawsuits added another layer of consequences that could affect their assets, their homes, their future earnings. Natalie, wait, Tyler said, stepping forward. I know I don't have the right to ask for anything, but could we talk? Just for a minute? Privately? I looked at my brother, remembering the child who had shared my bedroom when we were young, who had taught me how to ride a bike and helped me with my homework. I saw him now as a man who had chosen to protect criminals, rather than warn their victim, who had allowed his sister to be systematically defrauded while he remained silent. What would be the point? I asked. What could you possibly say that would change anything about what you've done? His face crumpled, but he tried again. I just want you to know that I never wanted it to happen like this. I never wanted you to get hurt. I was trying to protect everyone, trying to find a way to fix things without destroying the family. I studied his face for a moment, seeing the genuine regret there, but also recognizing the same patterns of thinking that had enabled this situation in the first place. The belief that protecting wrongdoers was more important than protecting victims. The assumption that family loyalty meant covering up crimes rather than holding people accountable. You weren't trying to protect everyone, I said quietly. You were trying to protect them, at my expense. There's a difference. I walked toward the door, my heels clicking against Tyler's expensive hardwood floors. Behind me, I could hear the murmur of urgent conversations starting up. Family members, trying to figure out damage control, trying to understand what came next now that their secrets were exposed, and criminal charges were pending. At the door, I turned back one last time to look at the family I had spent 3 years supporting financially, and a lifetime trying to please emotionally. They looked smaller now, diminished by the exposure of their deceptions and the reality of impending consequences. For what it's worth, I said, addressing the room as a whole, I really did love you all. I really did think that family meant something more than shared DNA and maintained secrets. I thought it meant honesty and mutual support and protecting each other from harm, not inflicting it. I paused, feeling the weight of 3 decades of disappointment and hope and misplaced loyalty. I was wrong about what this family was, but I wasn't wrong about what family should be. And I'm not going to apologize for refusing to enable criminal behavior just because the criminals happen to be related to me. I opened the door and stepped out into the Austin afternoon. The sun was still shining, the sky was still blue, and the world looked exactly the same as it had when I arrived at Tyler's housewarming party 3 hours earlier. But everything had changed for me in ways that felt both devastating and liberating. 6 months later, I sat in my new apartment in downtown Austin, reviewing the final paperwork from the criminal cases and civil litigation that had consumed my life since that afternoon in Tyler's living room. My father had been sentenced to 18 months in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution for the identity theft. My mother had received probation and community service, along with her own restitution requirements. Tyler had been charged as an accessory after the fact and received probation. The financial recovery process had been long and complex, but my credit was finally restored, and the fraudulent accounts had been removed from my record. The restitution payments would continue for years, but at least the debt that had been incurred in my name was no longer my responsibility. More importantly, I had learned something valuable about myself and about the difference between being alone and being lonely. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't walking on eggshells around family members, wasn't worrying about the next financial emergency that would require my intervention, wasn't trying to earn love and acceptance from people who had already decided I wasn't worth their honesty or respect. The silence in my apartment wasn't empty or sad. It was peaceful. It was the sound of a life that belonged entirely to me, free from the chaos and manipulation that had defined my family relationships for so long. I had discovered that cutting toxic people out of your life doesn't leave you with nothing. It leaves you with space for better things to grow. My phone buzzed with a text message from Carlos, my friend from work who had become a true confidant during the legal proceedings. He was checking to see if I wanted to grab dinner and catch a movie, the kind of simple, honest interaction that had replaced the complicated emotional manipulation I used to think was normal family behavior. I smiled and texted back that I would love to. As I got ready to leave for an evening with someone who valued my friendship without expecting financial support or unconditional loyalty regardless of their behavior, I reflected on how much my life had improved since I stopped trying to maintain relationships that were fundamentally based on deception and exploitation. The family I had been born into had taught me that love was conditional, that loyalty meant silence in the face of wrongdoing, that my value was measured by my willingness to absorb abuse and provide financial support without question or recognition. But they had been wrong about all of it. Real family, I had learned, was about mutual respect and honest communication, and protecting each other from harm rather than inflicting it. Real family was about celebrating each other's successes rather than exploiting each other's generosity. Real family was about trust that didn't require constant verification and love that didn't come with hidden costs. I locked my apartment door and headed out into the Austin evening, looking forward to dinner with a friend who had never asked me for money, never lied to me about their problems, never expected me to sacrifice my own well-being for their convenience. Looking forward to a life that was smaller but more honest, quieter but more genuine, lonelier perhaps in numbers but richer in quality. Behind me, the apartment held all the peace and possibility that came with choosing truth over comfort, accountability over enabling, self-respect over family obligation. And ahead of me lay an evening with someone who understood that real relationships were built on mutual care rather than one-sided sacrifice, on honesty rather than manipulation, on respect rather than exploitation. For the first time in my adult life, I was truly free, and it felt exactly like coming home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.